Ladies and gentlemen, AC/DC.
Well, I was out on the drive on a bit of a trip, looking for thrills to give me some kicks. Now I want you ladies, I shoot from the hip. I was born with a stiff upper lip. Looking down in hell, that bad in the pain, and I'm digging down, and I broke your thing. I keep a stiff upper lip, and I shoot from the hip, yeah. I keep a stiff upper lip, and I shoot. I shoot from the hip. Yes, I do.
Few bands are as enduring or as iconic as AC/DC. The no-nonsense riff monsters have been dominating the world of arena rock for the last 30 years. Reinventing hard rock with a fistful of classic albums, despite tribulations that would have crushed lesser bands, AC/DC are now a unique phenomenon. Welcome to the place where AC/DC are at their best and where no other act can challenge them. On the stage.
Don't you know nothing six? You can change your
You go and see AC/DC, you'll see a big rock show, you'll hear loads of classic songs, hugely powerful, hugely heavy, armour-plated live music. The music was written to be played live, unlike most bands who work hard to create the best possible album they can and then worry about how the hell they're going to reproduce this live. With AC/DC, it almost seems as if the albums are just tokens to keep the live work going rather than the other way round. Those songs sound as good live as they do on the album. They continue to do so. They've always been first and foremost a live band. They've been about entertaining audiences, about taking it out on the road and just going crazy.
In the 70s, it was kind of tame, wasn't it? There wasn't a lot going on musically. It was kind of like your prog rock, you got your disco, and kind of out of nowhere come these, out of the middle of nowhere, out the outbacks of Australia, which nobody really cared about in England. Nobody thought about Australia. There's this band, this dirty band in denim. They were drinking beer, and they were singing about loose women. They were singing about rock and roll, loud music. Friday night beer in it, large in it. And there they were, and everybody was a bit like, oh my lord, what is this? Conservative sort of society were quite shocked, I think, by what AC/DC came about. For many people, nobody had heard or seen anything just like that at all.
There will always be people who want to listen to those songs live one last time. I don't believe that flame will ever be extinguished.
They're absolutely peerless. They did what they did absolutely brilliantly, perfectly, really.
Let's face it, without AC/DC, there would be nobody playing air guitar. They dictate the future of music. They are rock and roll. They are a much-needed rock band, and they're just as relevant now than they ever have been. And I, for certainly one, will go and see them every time.
The roots of the globe-trotting rock monster that became AC/DC lie in a band called the Velvet Underground. Not the famous American art rock ensemble, this Velvet Underground was a group formed in Sydney, Australia in the early 1970s by a guitarist called Malcolm Young. By 1973, Malcolm was tired of his band's poppy formula and, looking for a harder sound, recruited his younger brother Angus into a new band and christened it AC/DC.
Because I used to play in school in bands and things, or with a few friends. And Malcolm was playing around Sydney in little club bands. And then he just turned around one day and said, why don't me and you play together and we'll get in people that we want to play with, you know?
Right.
And so it was mainly the two of us together. And we just got people who fitted in well with us. Bond came about a month later or so, you know. So it all sort of fitted pretty good.
Angus was a phenomenal guitarist despite his tender years, rehearsing with the band after school while still dressed in his uniform of shorts and a tie. His sister suggested that he wear the outfit for gigs as it was a distinctive, if slightly unusual look, and the trademark image of AC/DC was born. Even today, with Angus well into his 50s, the school uniform is still a key part of the band's charm.
Well, that was from the first go.
Yeah.
Yeah, my sister came up with that.
What did you think about it?
I thought it was, well, at the time I thought, what's this, you know? But then when I thought about it, and I thought, well, because Malcolm said to me, you know, we don't want to be in a, you know, just put an old run-of-the-mill band together, you know, a band that's just going to sort of have nothing with it, you know? So he said, it would be good if, you know, it'd be a good idea. You know? So I said, he always picked me being the smaller one and said, right, you have a go of it.
I think in a way the whole school uniform thing that Angus Young has always worn is a bit of a gimmick, but it's part of rock folklore. It's sort of grown with the band. And really it sprang from reality because Angus's older brother Malcolm, who of course is also in the band, and his even older brother George, who was in a band called the Easy Beats. Music's always been in the family, and Angus, being the youngest of those three, wanted to be part of it. But Malcolm probably had in the back of his mind, he was in a band called the Velvet Underground, not the famous band of that name, but just happened to be called that as well. But he had in the back of his mind that he wanted to form a more rocking blues and boogie-based band, and maybe he was just beginning to think that, well, hang on, my little brother Angus can play here. Let's get him in the band, let's try him out. So Angus initially would be rehearsing with AC/DC, still wearing his school uniform.
School uniform is ludicrous. I mean, in rock and roll terms, anybody wearing a school uniform is ludicrous. Rock and roll is meant to be about rebellion. It's not meant to be about, you know, wearing your school uniform. But then they tweaked it anyway. I mean, look at the Highway to Hell album cover. That's got, you know, it's a devil. You know, he's got his little devil horns on. He's holding his tail in his school uniform. It's kind of like, it's exciting. It is rebellious in that sense, but it is iconic, and it has stood the test of time. Even now, as a man just close enough to draw in his pension, he still wears it, and he still is kind of cool in it.
The band soon found gigs in Sydney and built a hungry local following. The group's first singer, Dave Evans, provided vocals to their debut single, Can I Sit Next to You?
They'd been playing with a guy called Dave Evans, who didn't have the image or the presence or the attitude to really front a band like AC/DC. He probably wasn't really aware of what the band was going to become. It was only when Bon Scott joined that the band the sound that we've come to know as AC/DC became what it is. He was absolutely integral to it.
Until this guy came up and stood by her side.
A move to Melbourne in 1974 led to a shake-up in the band. Singer Evans left after a dispute at a concert and was replaced by their driver, Bon Scott. Scott, a man with feral on-stage presence and a voice that could melt loudspeakers, was the ultimate frontman, living a genuinely rock and roll lifestyle and injecting the band's songs with tales of his own outrageous antics.
Bon Scott was a brilliant front person, quite feminine and feline for all of his sort of butch masculine vocal prowess. If you watch his performance, he's very lean, but he moves in quite a kind of feline way, which is a really nice counterpoint to Angus sort of doing his comedy duck walking across the stage. He wasn't a particularly mesmeric performer physically, but his voice was just incredibly commanding, and I think that's what makes him a dynamic performer.
Bon Scott brought to the very young AC/DC a huge dose of professionalism. He was an amazing singer, that much is clear, but he's also quite a few years older than the two young brothers. He'd had plenty of experience in previous bands. He'd actually had some success, especially in Australia, with bands that he'd been in. But he was a superb frontman. He was absolutely dynamic. He would just make the stage his own. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had this huge voice, kind of like a more aggressive version of Robert Plant, really. Had that, you could hit those high notes, but in a much more guttural way, particularly live. You know, he could really turn it on live.
Bon Scott was probably the first iconic rock and roll frontman born of the 70s. I mean, there's this chap, he's got his tight denim jeans on with his stick of broccoli down the front. He's got tattoos up his arms, big hairy chest, which, you know, the ladies liked in the 70s, and a very cheeky kind of know-it-all smile and a look in the eye. And ultimately, he was a very good frontman. I mean, he had all the makings of somebody that your parents wouldn't like, the ladies would like, because he was a bit of a bad boy, and he had the vocal cords to match as well.
Tell you what goes on dynamite. Now when the fight, our power low. Watch me start.
He was joined by drummer Phil Rudd, formerly of the band The Coloured Balls, and bassist Mark Evans. The new lineup brought the band a much-needed dose of musical expertise as well as a hard-living image thanks to Scott's criminal record for minor offences. Ironically, Malcolm and Angus, the cornerstones of the band, never really lived the life of rock and roll debauchery. Famously, they preferred playing Monopoly to raising hell after gigs.
I don't think it's fair to say that AC/DC were bad boys, although they did have that image, and that probably that image was quite helpful to them, particularly in their formative years. They were seen as being from the wrong side of the tracks. They had songs like Problem Child and Bad Boy Boogie and Rocker, which seemed to address that kind of life. They were tapping into, I think, a sort of a working class ethic of partying and drinking and just having fun. There was nothing pretentious about them. The fact of the matter is, though, that AC/DC weren't really into that aspect of the lifestyle.
Once the new band was established, AC/DC built a loyal Australian following on the back of two Australia-only albums, High Voltage and TNT, released in '74 and '75. A British and American tour followed the international release of a compilation from both albums, confusingly also titled High Voltage. AC/DC were rapidly gaining a reputation for bad boy antics, largely thanks to their songs about loose women and loud music. This paved the way for the 1977 album Let There Be Rock, the first real AC/DC classic, and also the first to feature new bassist Cliff Williams.
In 1955, man didn't know about a rock and roll show and all that jive. The white man had the smalls, the black man had the blues, but no one knew what they was gonna do. But Tchaikovsky had the news. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Let there be sound, and there was sound. Let there be drums. Wow, there was drums. Let there be guitar. There was guitar. Wow, let there be rock.
Let There Be Rock kind of basically took everything that AC/DC was already and just upped the ante just that much to make an album full of classic songs. I mean, the first song on there, Go Down, It's a classic. The lyrics are hilarious, really. Bon Scott talking about getting blowjobs from ladies and who's good at licking his stick. You know, it's hilarious, really. Quite how PC it is, I'm not sure, but people thought it was quite cheeky, I suppose, and the way Bon Scott delivered it was quite cheeky as well. I mean, it wasn't uppity. It didn't get people's backs up. It was slick, really.
Bon Scott was having much more of an influence in the band. His lyrics, his personal stories were coming in. And really, you just had some really good songs on that album. Some of the songs that are still considered to be classics today. The title track, I mean, Let There Be Rock, for example, is a live favourite and always will be. There won't be a time when AC/DC don't play that track live. It's got everything, you know. And there's almost like a reverence for it, you know. The whole, even the title, Let There Be Rock, it's almost a quasi-religious reverence for it, which the audience just gives back in spades. So that's obviously a classic, and it's helped AC/DC to escalate to the status of gods of rock for that very same reason.
On the kind of past, that rock and roll was born. And all across the land, every rockin' band was blowing up a storm. And the guitar man got famous, the businessman got rich, and everybody was a superstar with a symphony rich. And there were 15 million fingers learning how to play, and you could hear the fingers picking. And this is what they had to say: let there be light, sound, drums, guitar, wow, let me
Probably the most exciting and the best song on that album is the closing track, Whole Lotta Rosie. That is a track inspired again by one of Bon's lady friends on the larger side, and that song is a classic. I mean, it's 30 years old, and it is still played to death throughout the world. Whole Lotta Rosie is the ultimate song. It's got the ultimate riff in as well, AC/DC riff. Angus, you know, millions of audiences all around the world hear that riff and they know what to do, and that song is probably one of the classics on that album.
I want your story about the one I know. When they come to making love, Rosie steals the show. She knows I'm pretty.
I think the thing about AC/DC is the fact that and it might sound like a cliche, but they play the kind of music that transgresses age and gender and social mores, and I think that's a reason for their longevity, and arguably, of course, some of their, well, more than some, a large number of their songs are extremely dodgy. But it's really hard to deny the kind of plain, rocking, good time power of songs like Whole Lotta Rosie. And I think that with the sort of hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, those songs are a lot less offensive than even they might possibly have been at the time.
Whole Lotta Rosie, which is an absolute classic and still is. Enormous riffs from Angus Young, bravura vocal performance from Bon Scott. Again, they'll never stop playing that track. Yeah, it was just the moment when it all came together for AC/DC, and it launched them down the runway, shall we say.
Album Powerage was better still, amping up AC/DC's sound into a taut, take-no-prisoner set of killer tunes that some regard as their finest work to date. The band followed up this 1978 classic with a live album, If You Want Blood, You've Got It, which featured a blood-soaked Angus on the sleeve. By this stage, the raw energy of their live shows was becoming legendary, with fans flocking in their thousands to witness the riff spectacular that the band had honed to a fine art.
With AC/DC, even in the early years, it's always been about showmanship and power and entertainment. You know, that's been the main things those guys have done. Yes, the music's been very important, but they understand that you have to put on a show. Most bands in that time, that era, were concentrating too much on just playing the music well. Because in the 70s, you had to do that, because you would stand or fall on your live show. AC/DC, however, always were able to bring in something extra. You had Angus Young, he'd strut around the place, goose walking, doing all kinds of bizarre marches across the stage, of course wearing his school uniform outfit. And in total contrast to his brother Malcolm and Cliff Williams, who would stand at the back, almost out of the picture, only coming forward to bark out the backing vocals. Angus, it was as if he'd drunk a vat of Sunny Delight and was just ODing on a sugar rush. And also equally prominent, Bon Scott would be the tight jeans. He'd be sort of darting around the stage, grinning mischievously, shaking his head and so on. He'd carry Angus Young around on his shoulders. Just these little traditions that grew up and they've never stopped doing. AC/DC, despite being a bunch of, frankly, very ordinary looking guys, have always understood that you have to put on a rock show. And they obviously love it, and that's the reason why it works so well.
I mean, watching AC/DC live has always been and always will be a phenomenal experience. It is a real entertainment. Before AC/DC and all through the 70s and stuff, there was this prog rock thing and disco music, and it was a very separate thing. There was a separation between the audience and the band and the musicians. Angus Young and AC/DC they were like you and me. They were just people off the street playing rock and roll music and doing what they wanted to do.
I think the thing that distinguished AC/DC from a lot of other acts, sort of their peers, and it is the fact that the scene they came from was the pub circuit in Australia, which is a very sort of spit and sawdust, hard-working, you earn your stripes kind of scene. Also the nature of the audiences that they would have been playing to on Australia as they worked their way to the top before they became a mega stadium-sized act. I think it's reflected in the completely sort of unabashed, sweaty physicality of their performance. There's no barrier, there's no sort of psychological barrier, or a very, very small one between the band on stage and the audience. They're not posturing, they're not preening, they're not the peacocks, they're a bunch of sweaty blokes rocking and rolling.
The ascent of AC/DC in the 1970s was unstoppable. By now, Malcolm Young, the chief songwriter, had honed a formula which was simple and devastatingly effective. The best AC/DC songs from those far-off days consisted of a solid riff played in unison by two guitars and bass, and a simple but rock-hard drum pattern. To avoid complete overkill, Scott's vocals and Angus's lead guitar solos were distinctive and catchy, making the end product simply unforgettable.
The beauty of AC/DC's music is its simplicity. I mean, basically, it's rock and roll with a bit of boogie, whatever you want to call it. Guaranteed 3 chords, no more. Basic but hard-rocking beats with vocals over the top, be it Bon's or Brian Johnson's. and some tremendous guitar work by Angus Young on top of it all.
If you keep things simple, there's less chance of anything going horribly wrong. And that's basically what they've done for the last 30 years. But the way they play the guitars is simple, but it's so loud. There's so much power and volume in what they're actually putting out that it requires your singer, be it Bon Scott or Brian Johnson, to absolutely hollow their guts out. So everything AC/DC do, even though it is quite chunky, simple stuff, is incredibly powerful. And during the solos, of course, although again Angus isn't playing immensely elaborate, complex stuff, it's just so powerful that it just rips the roof off.
I think a lot of people overlook the melodicism of AC/DC songs as well, which was a kind of softening, a way of softening the songs, a way of making sure that they didn't have just bludgeoning power and nothing else. So they're extremely melodic with almost a pop sensibility, as well as rocking very hard and being riff heavy, and allowing Angus a lot of room to play around.
A good example of the effectiveness of the no-nonsense AC/DC formula came with the title track of the next album, Highway to Hell, a sing-along classic which has rocked stadium crowds for decades. Bon Scott was at the peak of his form, and the record made number 17 in America, a key breakthrough in that important but fickle rock market. It's a revealing sign of the impact of AC/DC that they could sell so many albums at a time when punk and disco were at their commercial peak.
AC/DC finally broke the American market for the same reason that any overseas band finally breaks the market, through being very, very good and very, very committed. They basically toured themselves to death in America, and they had a really strong album in Highway to Hell to back that up. It was produced by Mutt Lange, who was also to produce the famous Back in Black album.
Highway to Hell for me is one of my favourite albums. I always remember as a kid seeing the album cover with Angus Young with his little devil horns holding his devil's tail between his legs on the front of the cover and thinking, oh my lord, is this man the Antichrist or something? And as a small kid I was kind of shocked and horrified, and also quite intrigued about what this album was all about. I remember buying it, and it's got some good tracks on, Beating Around the Bush. Highway to Hell, the actual track itself, is a massive favourite still to this day. I mean, that came out in, 78? And it's a fantastic song. It's a very anthemic song, which is one of AC/DC's good qualities. They've got a good chorus that you can sing along to, you can punch in the air to.
I think American audiences just bought into the live work they were doing, the touring ethic. They could actually buy this album, Highway to Hell, and they can go and see this band AC/DC and actually play the thing note for note. You know, they sounded as good live as they did on the record, perhaps even better. There was a kind of a working class blue collar ethic there, which some people bought into. Middle America bought into that. There were a lot of rather pretentious bands around in the late 70s who would spend an awful lot of time playing elaborate solos and complex stuff. A lot of them seemed very pampered and complacent, didn't want to break out into a sweat on stage. AC/DC, of course, were the complete opposite of that. They were just, I've never actually seen a man sweat as much as Angus Young. I'm serious. I mean, you worry about the guy. The sweat literally pours from his head. That's why he's so small, I guess. He loses so much weight every time he goes out on stage. He never puts on any weight. So AC/DC would do this because they loved it and because they were able to tie into this sort of working class thing that was going on.
America is born on a country where if you work hard, you reap the rewards, and people are glad that you have. You know, they're glad that you've become successful. AC/DC went out there, they toured their asses off, and their basic rock and roll songs captured the hearts of everybody in America, and they sold a lot of millions of records over there.
Been around the bush.
By the end of the 1970s, AC/DC were on top of the world, playing to huge audiences, selling millions of albums and recording some of the best music of their career to date. However, their world was shattered on February the 20th, 1980, when Bon Scott suddenly died. Official reports stated that he'd drunk himself to death, but some uncertainty still surrounds the tragic events to this day. Few fans were surprised at the manner of Scott's passing, as he was infamous for his debauched lifestyle, but all were shocked at the event.
Bon Scott died under the mysterious, dubious circumstances of too much alcohol thrown in a car to sleep it off, and ultimately he died on his own vomit. And then somebody found him in the morning. It's very sad, very tragic, almost expected for somebody who had such a hedonistic rock and roll lifestyle, you know, known for his drinking and love of it. But it's always the tragic end, isn't it, when somebody dies prematurely.
I think in any other instance, the death of a singer of the stature of Bon Scott would also mean instant death for the band. It's almost impossible to imagine how a band would replace somebody as pivotal to their sound as Bon Scott. They lost this frontman who was so important to them, who was an incredible, awesome frontman. Who totally owned the stage and who the fans related to perhaps more than anybody else in the band. So Bon Scott's death was an absolute catastrophe for AC/DC, and many were amazed that they even considered carrying on.
I think there's always going to be a terrible moment of will they still manage it when a very high-profile, strong front person, or indeed any member of the band, passes away. More so with AC/DC possibly, because of course his voice was so much a part of the band's sound. But I think it's hard to imagine that the band could have done better than hire Brian Johnson. I mean, I know at the time there was a lot of he will never be as good. In fact, he was just as good vocally, a less commanding front person live, but vocally, absolutely 100%, 110% replacement fine.
I was playing with Geordie. I got a telephone call. They wouldn't say who it was, you know, they just said, I'm sorry, we can't tell you who it is because of the fact that there's been a bereavement in the band and we don't really think it's time to let anybody know who the band is. I'd never been for an audition in my life, you know. I said, I can't go to London, you know. I can't afford it.
You really couldn't afford to go down to London?
No, I was broke. I was very lucky. I had a good friend who lent us his car. And as soon as I walked in, it was like a real friendly atmosphere. They just said, oh, hello, and had a can of brown ale waiting for us. You know, they knew us from Newcastle, and can of brown ale. Yeah, come on, we know you might be nervous. And well, I was tired. I was knackered. I wasn't nervous. I was just saying, hey, let's do it. I've got to get back. I've got a gig tomorrow.
Well, Bon Scott and Brian Johnson are kind of similar. They're kind of worlds apart as well. I mean, Brian Johnson was from as a Geordie. I mean, he comes along in his little vest and his flat top, and he hasn't changed for the last 20-odd years. I mean, he's got a more of a shrill to his voice that Bon Scott had. Bon Scott was a bit more creamy, a bit more soulful. Still not the best singer in the world, quite raspy. And Brian Johnson kind of just extenuated that raspiness and slightly shrilly, which also came across in his live show as well. Live, if you look at the two, Bon was always upright, kind of swaggered around like he owned the stage, whereas Brian Johnson comes along, he's a bit squat and kind of just hunches up a little bit more and relies more on looking down when he screams a lot more, which is kind of interesting. You know, it's like the confidence of Bon on one hand. So, you know, Brian Johnson is confident but just takes it in a different direction. To say he's a singer would be wrong. You know, the guy squeals, he squawks, and somehow managed to reaches some notes that resemble tunes. But I mean, ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's about rock and roll. It's about working men coming from the streets and having a go and straining those vocal cords, just like the punk rockers did as well, you know, the punk movement of the 70s. It's that whole thing, you know, anybody can do this. And Brian Johnson would probably admit that he's no singer, but he does the job well for the music that he is providing vocals for. We did an album. It sold heaps and heaps and heaps, you know, right around the world, in countries that I've never heard of, you know. And I think the band itself's an honest, hard-working band. You know, they try the hardest to give the best value for money. I'd never been to America in my life until I joined AC/DC. And the first gig we did there, you know, straight into Madison Square Garden. And you know, just before I went on stage, I promptly got thrown out by the security, wondering what a bum like me was doing, hanging around Madison Square Garden. I mean, it was sold out, it was packed, and I couldn't get back in. So one of the chauffeurs who took me there spotted us, and he put us in the back of the limo, and he drove us back in again.
Not only was Johnson's first album with AC/DC a classic for the band, Back in Black went on to be recognised as one of the finest rock albums ever released. It subsequently sold over 10 million copies in America alone, A vast achievement which points directly at the excellence of the songs, such as the title track and the all-time classic anthem, You Shook Me All Night Long. This album ushered AC/DC into their commercial peak, the early 1980s, which saw them tour and record as one of the biggest bands on the planet.
If you were to only be able to buy one AC/DC album, Back in Black would definitely be the one to buy. It's quintessential, diamond-studded AC/DC.
The remarkable thing about Back in Black, and there are so many remarkable things about it, are first and foremost its incredible sales figures. Last year the album was certified to have sold 21 million copies in the United States alone, and it has been said that it has sold a total of 42 million copies worldwide, which actually makes it not merely the biggest rock album of all time, but the second biggest album of all time, second only to Michael Jackson's Thriller. It is almost impossible to believe, but any way you slice it, even if those figures aren't quite correct, Back in Black is an enormous achievement. It is a monster of sound. The production of Mutt Lange was hugely important to them, plus their songwriting was bang on. Hell's Bells, you know, the high voltage rock of Shoot to Thrill, and You Shook Me All Night Long, which pretty much is AC/DC's most immediately memorable song. Their first real bite at the big chorus anthem was Rock and Roll Damnation, which was a hit single. But You Shook Me All Night Long took that format and made it even better.
It's probably AC/DC's most sing-along album. I mean, Back in Black, You Shook Me All Night Long, still very popular now. I mean, that is such a sing-along AC/DC song. It wasn't the band recreating the past, it was a band looking at what they'd done before, got a new frontman in, and just upping the ante with themselves.
AC/DC maintained the incredible momentum they gained from Back in Black for 3 years, releasing the excellent For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, which was #1 in America.
For Those About to Rock, which came, it was the second album featuring Brian Johnson, and as a title track, it's an anthem that still you can celebrate now. I mean, it's got cannon fire in the middle of it, which is great live because they play that song live, and you know, for those about to rock, fire. I just whacked the microphone, sorry.
In rock and roll, it's always an extremely fine line between humour and parody, and I think AC/DC just understand where that line is. And arguably, having wheel-mounted cannons one on either side of the stage for Those About to Rock, We Salute You, is tipping into parody. But I think their self-awareness carries them through, and also I think essentially they like to have a laugh. They like to have a good time, and if that involves pyrotechnics and cannons, so be it.
To rock!
come those cannons from nowhere, and it's all about the cannons on the album cover, and live they just have this 21-gun salute, as it says, you know, and you've got all these cannons firing off in the middle of that song. And for a rock band to do that, it's the ultimate anthem, isn't it? For those about to rock, fire, poof, we salute you. I should join AC/DC. But ultimately, it's there. It's just a fantastic song. And bands don't write anthems like that anymore. It's not there anymore. Anthemic rock, you know, who does it better than AC/DC? No one.
Replacing drummer Rudd with Simon Wright, they then recorded Flicker the Switch, releasing it in 1983.
I mean, Flicker the Switch, when I bought the album, it's pretty rubbish. I mean, the band don't really play anything, as far as I'm aware, off that album. I mean, Bedlam in Belgium, what were they on about, you know? It's just like a rubbish album. I mean, the sleeve was all white, it had a little Angus flicking a switch, and I remember it being embossed, and it was quite exciting because it was an embossed album sleeve. But I mean, the embossedness of the album was probably the most exciting thing of that record. I've played it about 3 times. It was just rubbish. And the problem was, I think, that the band had certainly peaked with their success, their commercial success, and also the post-Bon era had kind of plateaued as well. The first 2 albums, the first album, Back in Black, people were excited that the band had got a new singer. With For Those About to Rock, the band had continued and proved that Brian was a no one-hit wonder with the band. But by the time Flicker the Switch came, it was a bit, didn't really... This song sang about rubbish things. It wasn't very interesting. The novelty had maybe worn off a little bit. And that kind of continued for the band's career for a while.
Certainly during the mid to late 80s, AC/DC's album sales declined drastically. However, all things should be put into context. Every album they've released has sold at least 1 million copies. So yeah, I mean, compared to selling 40 million copies of Back in Black, it's a disaster. But 99.9% of bands out there would sell their grandmother for the opportunity to sell at least 1 million copies of every album they produce, no matter how bad they are. So Flicker the Switch and Fly on the Wall didn't sell any more than about 1 million, which is regarded as a failure in AC/DC terms. But they retained, very importantly, their lifeblood, the core of their fan base, the hardcore, if you like, of AC/DC's fan base. So they still made successful albums. They still played big shows. They weren't doing anything like as well as they were with Back in Black and On Highway to Hell, For Those About to Rock. Those days were seen to be in the past, but they may have been seen to be treading water at this time. But I mean, most bands, as I say, we would kill to tread water as successfully as AC/DC did.
And so a long period of creative hiatus followed for Malcolm Young and his troops. The 1980s were not kind to many once great rock acts. The era of the Fairlight sampler and the new romantic movement didn't sit well with the blue-collar approach and songs about buxom females that sat at the heart of AC/DC's music. To the band's credit, they never tried to water down their music or pander to current trends, remaining true to themselves despite considerable industry pressure not to do so.
I think any band that has reached that sort of those sort of dizzying heights, enjoying a #1 album in America at a time when you're running counter to the tempo of the times, really, and your music is really quite Neanderthal in comparison, and you haven't absorbed any new technology at all. You haven't employed syndrums or synthesizers or any of the other things that were happening in technology at the time. You're bound to, if not suffer from a dip in fortunes, stasis is going to set in. You're not going to be able to add any. You're not going to be able to increase your audience. The best you can do is make. You're just going to have the same fan base, really.
Sex, drugs and rock and roll, that's what AC/DC are. And it almost became a bit passé towards that sort of middle 80s ground. It was a bit passé to sing about sex, drugs and rock and roll. They'd exhausted the canons and the whole anthem rock. You know, it had all hit a head, I think. And I think they were struggling, trying to find what to write about. They were struggling with their identities of what AC/DC meant to people. I mean, rock music was going through changes, music was going through changes, there was new bands coming out, new technologies, and people just were a bit unexcited about this band with a man in his school uniform. It had just become passé and a bit boring.
AC/DC's sound has changed over the years, although I think it should be stated their sound hasn't changed anything like as much as some bands have. But inevitably, you lose someone as important as Bon Scott, it's never going to be exactly the same again. And I don't just mean because of the sound of the vocals. Brian Johnson doesn't sound anything like Bon Scott vocally, but it's more than just that. Bon Scott was a significant writer for the band. His lyrics, his personal stories, his bawdy tales, shall we say, of drinking and womanizing and so on, which AC/DC's early material is characterized by. They tried to continue in that vein, but it wasn't quite the same. And Brian Johnson has written for the band, but he's clearly a very different influence to Bon Scott. And indeed, there was a couple of albums in which Brian Johnson didn't contribute anything at all because he was off doing other things. And the Youngs, Angus and Malcolm, became more and more of the prevailing influence, shall we say. It was no longer a partnership between them and Bon Scott. This was Angus and Malcolm Young's band, end of. To the point at which they started to produce their own albums. After Back in Black, eventually they got rid of Mutt Lange's services and they actually produced at least two albums by themselves, which is where it all started to go a bit wrong. One critic said they made the same album 9 times, which is fine if the music's good, but it was starting to sound a little bit stale. The format was fairly similar. They hadn't deviated too much away from that, but after an album like Back in Black, there's only one way to go, unfortunately, and it is downhill.
In 1990, a new appreciation of rock music began to make itself felt. Fans were beginning to look back at icons of years gone by, and AC/DC capitalised on this by releasing their best album in years, The Razor's Edge. AC/DC scored a significant coup in 1995 when renowned producer Rick Rubin worked with them on a new album, Ball Breaker. More tours followed, and AC/DC's most recent album, Stiff Upper Lip, was a success in the year 2000.
Well, I was out on the drive on a bit of a trip, looking for thrills to give me some kicks. Now I want you ladies, I shoot from the hip. I was born with a stiff upper lip. Looking down in hell, right bad in the climb, and I'm digging down, and I'm will step up a limb. And I see from the hip. Yes, I do.
In relatively recent years, AC/DC's output has slowed down dramatically, to the point at which their last album was actually released in 2000, which now seems a very long time ago. But I think what those albums have done is sustained the legend. They had to put something out in that time, otherwise it would purely be about nostalgia for AC/DC, in which no band wants that to be the case. A Ball Breaker was a solid album. It kept AC/DC going during that kind of very lean time in the mid-90s, when the whole rise of grunge and alternative rock had actually strangled some classic rock bands out of existence altogether. Stiff Upper Lip, however, in 2000 was a comeback of sorts. That sold more, and they actually had a #1 hit single in America with the title track. So this clearly was not a band in decline.
Stiff Upper Lip came out in 2000, and you know, by then it was kind of like, oh great, a new AC/DC album, but it's pretty much like the old one, you know, the other ones that they've just done before that. Most people don't really know, and it's only the diehards that will go and listen to it, but they're hardly memorable songs.
You know, arguably any band only ever has one set of you know, it has a kind of maximum number of riff-tastic songs, and maybe if they've just previously packed a bunch of riff-tastic songs onto an album, they need to go away and write some more. But they're a live draw, essentially. They put on an amazing show, and there are a lot of bands like that. You could say the same thing about Van Halen in the, you know, as well, for example. You're not going to buy their records, but you might well be drawn to go and see them live for the experience. It's extraordinary.
The beauty of AC/DC, even with their commercial, when they went beyond their commercial heights of success, they were still a great live band. And the good thing about AC/DC is they deliver the goods every time you go and see them. You want to see a show, you want to see Angus, you know what to expect with AC/DC. It's like you go to the pub and you expect a good pint, you know what you're going to get with AC/DC. You know that you're going to get a whole lot of Rosie. You'll know you'll get all your classics. Even if you know, we can forgive them for a few Duff records. We can forgive any band for a few Duff records, as long as they don't play too many of those songs live. You go and see AC/DC live, and you will get a good show. And that's what kept the band going. They became, okay, well, their albums aren't great, but we know that they're good live, and we'll still go and see them live, and they will still be totally on the ball.
I do feel as if they're probably gearing up to one last album and one last big celebratory world tour. That said, rock and roll has a habit of getting into your blood, and it may well be that these guys just genetically are incapable of actually going into retirement or understanding the meaning of that. They clearly still love what they do. They don't want to stop. They just want to make this next album as good as it can possibly be. Maybe the only thing that will stop AC/DC now is old age and infirmity, proving the old adage that it really is a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.